Welcome to Your Lettings Journey, a brand new podcast that's essential listening for landlords with property in North London. Now, everyone will have their own unique landlord journey, from the way they get into property to the way they hang up or pass on their keys, and then all the different decisions in between. But along the way, we're all faced by many of the same issues and potential pitfalls. I'm Rachel.
And I'm Romesh, and together we have a lifetime of experience as landlords, letting agents and tenants that we want to share with you to help you navigate your lettings journey.
So if you're an experienced landlord wanting to make sure that you're keeping on the right side of all the rules and regulations, or if you're completely new to this game and don't know where to start, then this is the podcast for you.
Your Lettings Journey is produced by Belvoir Enfield and Central Housing Group. For more information, visit belvoir.co.uk/Enfield and centralhousinggroup.com.
Hello. If you want the best chance of having a successful tenancy, then it makes sense that you need to get tenant selection right at the very beginning. But is that just a matter of outsourcing tenant referencing to a third-party company? Or is there more to it than that? Let's see. Okay, so this week we are talking about tenant selection. Last week we were talking about eviction and how do you get your property back? How do you remove a tenant from your property? And two of the key areas where this was likely to come up were if there's damage to your property, antisocial behaviour and damage, or if there are arrears in a property. And we kind of hinted that if you get the tenant selection right, you're less likely to experience those kind of issues. So we wanted to delve a little bit deeper into the world of tenant selection.
Okay, Rachel. Well, to me, it seems fairly straightforward. If you've got an agent and they say, look, found a tenant, fully referenced, everything's hunky-dory, good to go. Surely that's it.
Wouldn't it be lovely if that was the case? Yeah, you're quite right. A lot of people think, okay, referencing is something that my agent does. And at some point they will come back to me and say, yes, your tenant is fully referenced and they're ready to move in on this date. Thank you very much. And off we go. It's not always that simple, unfortunately. So you have the formal referencing, yes. And I would always say if somebody fails formal referencing, don't take them. But you also have referencing that I think needs to be done in-house at the same time. You also have to think about how good the referencing is that's taken place. So was it carried out by your agent? Did you carry it out yourself? Or was it carried out by a third-party specialist company? And if it was done by a third-party specialist, have they read between the lines? Because they quite often have a massive applications and it's, sort of computer says yes, computer says no type thing. So there's that. And then also, we were talking, I think, about the average tenancy lasting over 4 years now. Well, in 4 years' time, people's lives can change drastically. So someone who perhaps referenced beautifully on day one, 3 years down the line, very different kettle of fish. So it's never quite as simple as, yes, you've passed referencing. I know you're going to be a fantastic tenant from this point on.
Sure. Okay, well, look, sticking with formal referencing, as a landlord, what do I need to do to make sure the tenant actually pays that rent?
Okay, so there are generally 3 bits to formal referencing. So you have employment check, you have landlord check, and then you will have credit check. So in terms of is my tenant actually going to pay their rent, and are they going to be able to pay their rent and wanting to pay their rent? First thing you would look at is what is their credit history like? So if somebody has a county court judgment, or if they've been declared bankrupt or have a voluntary agreement or anything like that, it's a red flag. So I won't go into the details of, the amounts and the durations and all that sort of thing, but generally that is a very big red flag because it kind of says, I'm not great at paying my bills. Okay. Yeah. Then you would also look at bank statements. So is this person good at handling their money? So we ask for 3 months of bank statements. Are they good at handling their money? Are they living in their overdraft? Does it look like they are accidentally going overdrawn every month? Do they have things coming out that look like they are paying off some form of, large bill?
Yeah.
On an employer's, so from an employment point of view, Do they have a stable employment? People can be employed, self-employed, etc. If they're self-employed, then yes, we need an accountant, or we need to see the accounts, so maybe from an accountant or from themselves, but we need to see what their profit is on their company. So that sort of thing. How long have they been in their job as well? Is it a stable job that
Sure.
they're in? The very basic that we do before we even get to formal referencing is affordability. So for most agents, they will want a multiple of the rent to be seen to be coming in terms of affordability. So for us, it's 2.5 times the rent. You need to earn or have earnings and savings of 2.5 times the rent to pass referencing without the need for a guarantor. So those sorts of things are the precautions that we take to make sure that somebody will be paying their rent and not falling into arrears.
Sure. No, okay. That's great, the affordability and the financial side of things. But how do we ensure that there's no chance that they're going to cause damage to my property as a landlord?
And that comes primarily down to the previous landlord's reference or current landlord's reference. So again, as part of the formal referencing, the current landlord will be asked various questions. So is this your tenant? How long have they been living with you or in your property? How much rent do they pay? Are they in arrears? Have they been in arrears? Have they damaged the property? It's it's ridiculous really when you think about it, because it is just that one question at the end that says, have they damaged the property?
Sure.
But it's really, really very, very important.
I mean, what's the best way to get that sort of landlord reference? Is that via phone or writing, or what do you advocate?
Well, in terms of the formal, they definitely prefer to have that in writing. And the reason for that, obviously, is if it turns out to have been a false application, in terms of just made up. So they've given you a landlord who's not actually their landlord.
Yeah.
You want to have that in writing. But also you have obviously situations where a landlord will want their tenant to move on.
Yes.
And so it's not in their interest to say, yes, they've trashed my property. So in those circumstances, you want to be able to have that in writing, that this landlord actually came back and said everything was fine. But, you can go back through history and potentially prove that everything wasn't fine, that they lied on that reference. And then it makes everything, then you can potentially go back and sue people. I mean, I don't know if that happens, how much that happens, but that's why they like it in writing.
Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine that would have happened easily. Or I
think it would only happen in the most severe cases, really. Yeah. But there's always that risk. You are looking into damage and taking the only reference on it from the person who may well want to get them out of their property. So it's a bit tricky.
Sure.
So that's one of the things. I know we will come on to this later, but that's one of the things where I would always potentially recommend phoning up the landlord as well, landlord or letting agent, phoning them up and saying, okay, tell me about this person, because then you get to be a bit more unstructured and you can read between the lines on what people say. So people still tend to be quite cagey about what they're saying. But if somebody says, oh, yes, they're wonderful tenants, really sad to see them go, etc., etc. Okay, they're good tenants. It's unlikely they've damaged anything. If you get one word answers and a reluctance to say anything else or enter into any small talk conversation with you at all, then it's quite possible that they're not a great tenant.
So,
possible.
So if you're a tenant of, say, a larger agency, are you able to sort of get that same response and feeling from other agents about when you do that phone call?
Again, that depends greatly. So landlord, yes, they're more than likely going to know their tenants, so you can gauge their response quite easily. Big agency, quite possible that the person at the end of the phone hasn't had any dealings with them whatsoever. So it's kind of a bit, you have to use judgment. Are they giving you one-word answers because they don't know that person, which actually might be a good thing because it means they've not been in any trouble, so to speak. Or are they giving you one-word answers because they're being careful? Sure. So some of that you can kind of gauge by the way somebody just talks to you in general. Are they light? Are they fluffy? Are they friendly? Or are they being very formal and very stiff?
Sure.
So
if I was a self-managing landlord, could I not think about, or as you as an agent, have you ever carried out a home visit on a prospective tenant to see how they're living at the moment and how they look after the property?
The only time I've done that is where somebody had a pet. They had a rather large pet. They had a Rottweiler, and so they looked absolutely fine as tenants, but the landlord was a little bit concerned about having a Rottweiler in his house.
Yeah.
And basically agreed with the tenants that I would come round and see them and see how said pet was living, see if there was any damage to the property, if it was, if it smelt particularly doggy, if the garden was covered in dog mess and all that sort of thing. So I just said, can I come around and meet the dog? Didn't particularly say I want to have a look around your home, but just, can I come around and meet the dog? Everything was fine. Yeah, it was, and they moved. They moved in with us, so yeah, it's absolutely fine.
And you weren't terrified? I would have been terrified.
It was a big old dog. It was a big dog. But I like dogs, so no, it's fine.
Property reference. Not property. Pet. Pet references. Obviously, that's an issue. There's obviously we're a nation of pet lovers. I think the stat is 49% of renters have pets or like pets or want to have a pet. How do you sort of factor that in terms of the damage element? Because from a landlord's perspective, I often get landlords say to me, "I don't want a pet in my property." Yeah,
you do. The default is generally from people no pets. That's the default, and then you get to talk to them about pets aren't necessarily bad. Most people have pets, it's a difficult one. I'm a bit of a pet lover anyway, and we quite like pets in that pets tend to make people more stable as well.
Right.
So they're more likely to put down roots for a long time as well if they have pets. In terms of damage, back in the old day, you would ask people for a bigger deposit. I think it used to be around 2 weeks extra deposit to cover any additional damage. You can't do that now. So you do hear times of people having charging slightly more rent to cover the fact that there is a pet there. And I think there's talk about having more pet insurance now that they're suggesting tenants would take out. So I think all of that is going to change, or the situation will improve quite a lot when the law changes to say, you need to consider pets more fully. But having said that, when we've got the issues with supply and demand that we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, if you've got a landlord who says, I'm not keen on pets, thanks very much, but you have a pet, it's another reason that perhaps you won't make it to the top of the list of people to be selected.
Sure. Yeah, no, absolutely. Last week we talked about fraud, and question landlords have said to me over the years is, I've let through a private agent and, it turns out this was a fraudulent tenant. And you think to yourself, well, how can a fraudulent tenant slip past a good, competent agent?
Yes, they do, because there are some very clever people out there. And as times get harder and it gets more difficult to find a property, then people come up with more imaginative ways of getting around things. So for example, we use a third-party company to do our referencing. And one of the main reasons we do that is because we are not experts at it. It's not something that I'm particularly skilled at, if you like. So I like doing the between the lines stuff. But, if somebody sends me, as I've had experience of, fake bank statements, I had the referencing company phone me up and say, did you spot anything about that bank statement, Rachel? I was like, no. What was I supposed to spot? Have a look at it again, Rachel. No. Okay, Rachel, have a look at this page. No. Have a look at this line. Okay, yeah, I get where you're going with this one. And literally at that point, it's like, okay, clearly you can then see this is a dodgy bank statement. This is not right. So, and you can buy, probably shouldn't say this, but you can buy fake bank statements. You can buy fake pay slips, and you can buy fake utility bills. And that's one thing, talking to referencing companies, or talking to a referencing company, they're saying that their applications, I think it's now 1 in 1,000 that they spot as being fraudulent. And the majority of that fraud is actually fake pay slips. So am I going to kid myself that I would be able to spot every fake pay slip? No. And I dare say that they don't spot them either.
So what you're saying really is it's definitely worth using those professional referencing kind of
Yes.
companies who are experts in that field.
You need to cover yourself in the same way that you would get a landlord reference in writing. You need to have somebody else tick boxing and saying, yes, we are happy this has passed.
Sure.
It's just some form of insurance, basically, that somebody else has done that work and they're taking responsibility for it.
It reminds me a little bit about when the right to rent checks first came out, when there was lots of concern about the possibility of landlords being held responsible for identifying fraudulent passports and fraudulent ID and documents, etc. Really, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And everyone complaining about, that's not necessarily our role. So a lot of that is, I believe, I don't get involved in that side of things myself anymore, but a lot of that is done by the government website. It's all done online, the majority of it. But yes, we do still look at people's passports and look at them and make sure this is the same person stood in front of us. So yeah, it is another check.
Sure. So, I mean, look, we've talked about the formal referencing. We've talked about the employment referencing. We've talked about the financial checks. I mean, I think you sort of alluded to it earlier. There's sort of a little bit more to it. There's gut, there's instinct, there's fluff, reading between the lines. Talk to us about that and how you sort of deal with that.
I mean, we always say, I think I said this earlier, we always say if somebody passes the formal referencing, great, step one. Do they pass our informal referencing? If they pass it and, our gut feel is good, great, fabulous. If they don't, then we will voice our reservations to the landlord and say, okay, well, this is what we think. We leave the decision down to you. We're recommending or we're not recommending this person based on X, Y, Z. So we use every touch point with a tenant or with a prospective tenant. I was going to say to make judgments, and I guess we probably are making judgments. We're making an informed judgment about people, if you like. So if somebody phones up, how are they on the phone? Can we have a conversation with them? Are they answering our questions fully? Are we able to build any kind of rapport with them? So I know when you phone a lot of agencies, it's very tick box. What is your name? What is your phone number? How much do you earn? Where do you work? Why are you looking to move? Blah, 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 blah. But we try very much to have a bit of conversation with them to try and get a feel for them, because then people let their guards down and they say things. Sure. Then if we invite someone to if we invite someone to come to a viewing, do they turn up on time? Are they happy to take their shoes off? Things like that. Are they going to take care of the house? Are they happy to take their shoes off? How do they behave when they're there? Does what they say in person match up with what they said on the phone? If they have children and the children come along, which we would generally encourage, are they running around in a really unruly manner? Or are they, quite well behaved and, generally quite happy, et cetera, et cetera? And if a baby starts crying as soon as they walk into the property, that's generally not a good omen. It's not a reason for ruling them out, of course, but it's not a good omen.
So babies need to be on their best behaviour.
Babies need to be very well presented and on fabulous behaviour, yes. But no, and then if we ask them to fill in an application form, does that application form come back quickly? Is it completed? Is it completed completely? Is it a full application? Does it have errors in it? So, when it comes to the employment, etc., if they put down an employer and that employer has a Yahoo account or a Gmail, it's like, no, your employer should have a proper email address. Sure. Does their employer, do they have a mobile number? Well, no, we want a landline number. That sort of thing. Why are they doing that? So we'll do that side of things. And then when it comes to discussion, when it's actually going through referencing, are they a bit evasive about things? Do we get calls from the referencing company saying, are we, we're still waiting for this, we're still waiting for that, they won't upload bank statements, da 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 da. So you get a gut feel for people from that sort of thing.
And do you sort of look at sorry, no, you mentioned something earlier. You said, if you can engage in conversation with them and, build up a rapport with them. And I thought to myself, well, my daughter's actually quite shy and she doesn't like talking to people and to new people especially. So, I mean, sometimes I guess somebody who's not so confident and extroverted would possibly struggle with that informal sort of screening in a way, wouldn't they?
Yeah. And it's not just a matter of, this is an agency for extroverts or anything like that. It's, we're not, yes, there are people who perhaps aren't that chatty, and that's, it's absolutely fine. There are also people who, don't have English as their first language. And so it's harder to build up a rapport there. And we take that into consideration. So, we're not hard and fast in that respect.
So if I was a landlord, which I am as well, and I want to protect myself, what would be the ways to protect myself after doing all those checks? How can I actually have some more cast iron protection moving forward once we've selected this tenant?
Yeah. And again, this is something we talked about last week. I know that with timescales taking so long to get properties back, you do need to make sure that you protect yourself. So from our point of view, we offer all of our landlords a rent guarantee.
Is that something they would have to pay for? Is that something they pay for?
That is an additional cost. Yeah, it is basically an insurance, if you like, that if a tenant doesn't pay rent, that the company would still cover their rent, so they're not out of pocket.
Yeah.
And also, if they ever needed to evict, it takes care of all the court costs and bailiffs and all that sort of thing. So we do offer that, and it's offered by our referencing company. So people have to be able to pass referencing at that point. They have to actually pass referencing. Or we'd ask for a guarantor. So if affordability isn't as it should be, or if somebody is new to the UK and doesn't have any real kind of background here, then we can ask for the landlord could have a guarantor as well. So there are those options.
Sure. Talking about guarantors, I mean, a guarantor remains in place for the entire length of the tenancy. Is that correct? Am I right in saying that? So,
yeah, it's a little complicated. So, yes, they're in place for the length of the tenancy. We have contractual tenancies, so they're contractual. They go contractual periodic, our tenancies. So officially, it's complicated because I like guarantors in order to be able to get me a rent guarantee. So for me, as long as the rent guarantee company are happy that the guarantor's in place and they don't mind that guarantor is in place and stays in place, because we tend to just roll to periodic, then as long as the rent guarantee company are happy, then I'm happy. In terms of if you're a landlord and you need to take that guarantor to court because the tenant hasn't paid rent, then yes, obviously that is easier and you have a cast iron case, if you like, if it's within the term of the tenancy. So like within the fixed term. If you were perhaps trying to go to court with a guarantor and they haven't signed a tenancy agreement in 6 years, then I'm not sure how that would go personally.
Yeah.
And I also don't know what would happen if the guarantor turned around partway or through the periodic term and said, actually, I'm actually specifically saying I don't want to be a guarantor anymore for this person.
Yeah.
Because then you've got someone in your property who does not have a guarantor, who you could not use as a guarantor if they fell into arrears. And I think that's a little bit on the tricky side. So for me, I use a guarantor because of the rent guarantee, not because I particularly want to be able to claim back from that guarantor myself, because I think that would be problematic. And so people reference every year, but what do you do if, or not reference every year, but they sign a new contract every year. But what do you do if at year 2, the guarantor says, well, no, I'm not signing this? Do you remove your tenant at that point, or do you leave the landlord with less protection?
Yeah.
It's complicated.
Good question.
And so if you are going to get a guarantor, the guarantor should be somebody who is a very close family or, very close family friend. It always concerns me when we say to people, oh, you're going to need to have a guarantor. And they say, okay, I'm sure I can find one. Alarm bells are ringing slightly. Yeah.
Sure.
Mums and dads make fabulous guarantors.
Yes, agree. So would you say, sort of the rent guarantee and the guarantor issue, can this lead to potentially discrimination? Would you say?
Yeah, it is a difficult one because we all know that you can't and should not discriminate against people who are receiving housing benefits or any form of support. And actually, that's one of the things I wanted to say about affordability wise. We had a case recently where my colleague, who's a bit of a genius when it comes to housing benefits and affordability and all that sort of thing, because people automatically think I'm on housing benefits, therefore I'm going to need to have a guarantor. And this person was able to qualify with the benefits that they received for various different things I think they were able to evidence, what property was it for? I think it was like £1,200, I think the rent was on this property, but was able to guarantee with the benefits, or was able to confirm with the benefits that she was receiving, that actually affordability-wise, so 2.5 times the rent, she was able to take this property on her own, still qualify for the rent guarantee without needing a guarantor. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I hope that makes sense. I've made a complete disaster in explaining that. But so although she was on housing benefits, she did not need a guarantor, basically. She still qualified, or we could still take out the rent guarantee. However, does it lead to some form of discrimination? I suspect it probably does, because yes, if you're on a lower income, there is more chance that you are not going to reach the affordability levels, and therefore you will need to have a guarantor before you can have that property. And if you are looking at a big property, so if you are, you've got 2-3 children, you're in a 3-bedroom house, you're looking at £1,700 a month. My math is going to fail me, so I'm not even going to go there. But let's say you need a guarantor who's going to be on about 60-something thousand a year. Yeah. And not everybody knows people who are earning 60-something thousand. So yeah, that makes me a little bit uncomfortable sometimes when I say to people, you're going to need a guarantor who's earning this amount of money. And I just think, yeah, do you know that? Do you know people who do? And then on top of that, having a guarantor makes you less attractive anyway, in terms of the landlord. And if you need to have 2 guarantors to make up that amount of money, then yeah, again, it's a higher risk and therefore you're less attractive again. So it is a difficult one. And I think the council have cottoned onto this, because I think they now also have a guarantor scheme. I don't know that much about it. I've literally just seen it in an email. But on top of them offering people who need help the rent in advance, the deposit, an incentive to landlord to take this person on, I think they also now have some form of a guarantor scheme as well. I don't know how it works, but it is recognition that people are going to need guarantors, and potentially they're not going to know people who could be guarantors for them. So yeah, I think it is something that makes me somewhat uncomfortable. And
I think it's more challenging as well, because the local housing allowance rates have been frozen since, I think, 2020. So they're not due to increase until 2024 is what I've heard in the press. So the gap between the maximum local housing allowance rate payable for a size property compared to what the market rate is grown considerably, especially in the current conditions we're in now. So
that doesn't affect so much the affordability, but it does possibly mean more likely to fall into arrears, to start falling into arrears. Yeah.
Well, I mean, from the council's perspective, I have heard from them that they're not happy when a tenant is agreeing a rent which is £300-400 in excess of the local housing allowance rate, because how are they going to be able to afford that and be able to pay that additional sum?
Exactly. That's what I mean. So when it comes to tenant selection and referencing, they would still be able to pass referencing with a guarantor. They wouldn't pass it necessarily on their, more than likely not going to pass it on their own. They will pass it with a guarantor. But realistically, from a landlord perspective, they're more likely to fall into arrears.
Yeah,
no.
Absolutely.
Or they're more likely, as I think we talked about, not be able to pay other things, and then, there's damage to property, et cetera, et cetera. And again, this is one of those things where we do a bit of fluff. And so we will look at, okay, if this person is on a low income, or for whatever reason doesn't match the affordability themselves, realistically, can they afford to pay the rent? Can they afford to eat, heat, et cetera, themselves? And so we do use part of that as our own referencing, if you like, our own internal judgment to say, is this person going to get into trouble? Is this person, one, car breakdown away from actually potentially falling into arrears.
Sure.
And it's difficult because you're making that judgment about somebody else. It's difficult.
Okay, moving on slightly, Rachel. Imagine we've got 3 or 4 equally suitable tenants for a property. And as a landlord, you've got the agent saying to me, or I've got 4 tenants I found, and they all look great on paper, and all the checks, and it's very hard to distinguish between them. How could those tenants improve their chance of selection, and which would sway you as a landlord to choose and make some, choices between them? I think.
Ooh.
I mean, the obvious one I think would be extra rent. If somebody's offering to pay an additional sum, but obviously equally, one doesn't want to create this bidding war situation, because I don't think it's healthy and I don't think it's right personally, to just start making tenants bid against each other to increase the rent. The landlord's the only beneficiary there, and tenants are being sort of what's the word? Bled unscrupulously a little bit.
Yeah, I don't like it. I don't like the asking people for extra rent. There's been, I think, only a couple of properties where I've said to a landlord, I would happily pick any of these people to be a tenant at your property. And the landlord's come back and said, okay, well, can we ask them for a bit extra? I don't like it. I don't like it at all. And I've had a couple of situations where tenants themselves have said, I'm happy to pay X amount more. I don't particularly like that either. And I often find that the people who are saying to you, I want this so much, I'll pay an extra 50, I'll pay an extra £100 a month. I often find those people are perhaps not the people you want in that property anyway. And actually offering extra money makes me more wary of them.
Yes, no, absolutely. How about paying up front? I mean, if someone says, well, I'll pay in advance for 3 months, 6 months, a year, does that happen often? And, how do you handle that?
I don't like it. Again, sometimes people do that because they don't pass the affordability, but they say, okay, well, I don't want to have a guarantor, but I will pay you 6 months up front. I don't particularly like that because it affects my rent guarantee.
Yeah.
For one thing. And then I have to re-reference them again at month 4 to see if their circumstances have changed, or I have to take another 6 months up front to cover the next months. And then what happens if they don't want to pay that? And then I have to go through the process of removing them from the property. So I don't like that, to cover the fact that affordability hasn't been reached. I also generally don't like it anyway, because we would then have to internally hold on to that money, because if you pay the landlord and something goes wrong and that tenant needs to move out during those 6 months, then we're very reliant on the landlord giving that money back to us to then give to them, which so we should be holding on to property rather than the landlord. And that doesn't really do anything to me. It's of no benefit to me. I can understand it would be for a landlord if they've got money in the bank, but it doesn't really do me any good. So, and also, very lastly, you have to be very careful if you take a large amount of money or multiple months' rent to make sure that your tenancy agreement is actually right. Because if your tenancy agreement is wrong, and that money is then deemed to represent a period, so rather than a monthly tenancy period, it's deemed to be a 6-month tenancy period, that can cause all sorts of problems if you then want to serve notice. How long is the period that you have to give 2 periods notice of?
Oh, it sounds very complicated.
So I don't like it. Yes, and I've not made it sound any easier. So I don't like money up front, basically. No.
Right. Okay, that's interesting. I don't know if you were listening recently on Good Morning Britain. Eamon Holmes and Isabel were discussing with an eviction specialist, Paul Champlina, who I'm sure many of us would have heard about, that tenants are now in London are being asked to put forward their LinkedIn profile, send in photos and CVs. Is this relevant? I mean, Isabel was, sort of asking the questions to Paul, and I don't know what your thoughts are really on that.
The photos side of things, I'm just no. I haven't heard of that one before. People do write in. I've never had to actually ask people to write to us and give us a CV or anything like that. But people do obviously want to make themselves more attractive.
Yeah.
So it's like if you're going for a job, you will do things that make you more attractive to that employer to say, hey, give me the job. So they're just doing the same with the property and saying, hey, this is my CV. This is how fantastic a tenant I've been. Here is all my background. Here are references from my previous landlords, et cetera, et cetera. I've got family in the area, all that sort of stuff that just makes you more attractive to a landlord and makes you seem less of a risk. I can understand entirely why people do it, given the market at the moment.
Yeah. I think
do I ask for it? No.
I think there's, I think it's probably a little bit of shock and surprise because this hasn't happened in the lettings market before, but it regularly goes on in the sales market. When people are looking to buy a property, they would put their best foot forward and demonstrate why they'll be an amazing and excellent buyer and why they're in such a strong position. And, which I've done in the past when I've wanted to buy a property. You've sort of tried to sell yourself in your best light to show that you'd be the best person to buy this property and proceeding conclude. So I guess it's the same version happening in lettings, which we've never seen before. That's the surprise of it all.
No, I don't agree. I think people generally, when it comes to lettings, do or should present themselves as well as they can. It's just that things are now much worse than they were, and so they need to try much harder to make themselves
to a level
seem
we've
like
never
the perfect
seen before.
person for a property. Yeah, no, exactly. But people always, I think people generally have always turned up to viewings, etc., and tried to be nice and amiable and personable and everything else. Because I'm sure people know that if they turn up and they're rude to the agent or rude to the landlord, that it's not going to go down well. Because you just think, well, how are we going to work together going forward? We're not.
Absolutely. No, I think that's interesting. It was just interesting to hear it on the news. It just shows the state of the market, really. So, are there any other things you would recommend a landlord should do to reduce their risk once the tenant's moved in?
Yeah, I mean, as we said, you've got your referencing at the beginning that is your stake in the ground at that point. But things change as time goes on. So someone who had a fantastic job at day one may well have been made redundant at some point during their tenancy, or a couple with two good incomes may have split up, or somebody may have a new partner who is not the nicest person in the world. So all those sorts of things can change. So really, you can't take it for granted that the referencing you did on day one is as it is going to hold forever. So you do need to keep in touch with the tenant. You need to keep conversation and communication open. And you need to make sure that you're visiting the property and that you don't just sort of say, oh, well, they're a very nice person. They call me if they ever need anything. But no, I haven't been round in the past 2.5 years. You're kind of asking for trouble then. I know a lot of landlords find it difficult and uncomfortable. And there are times when I find it really uncomfortable. You're going around to another adult and you're then making judgments on how they live in their home, which is, it's not nice. Sure. Would you like to show me around your room, around your house rather? Love to, Rachel. It can be awkward. So I understand that a lot of landlords don't want to do that, but you really do need to. You need to make sure who is in your property and how your property is being treated. And if you don't keep going around, then you're not maintaining that relationship with your tenant, because ideally you want your tenant to come to you and say, actually, bad stuff has happened and I'm going to struggle to pay the rent. I'm going to be open and honest with you. I'm going to struggle for the next month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months, what have you. I've got some big payment, some big thing has happened and I'm going to really struggle. And then you can get plans and everything in place. So it's not a shock when actually, you're 2-3 days late with the rent. What's happened? Yeah, I can't pay this month. You want that information up front. So keeping communication lines open and inspecting your property is key.
Sure. No, I think really good sound advice, Rachel. So in summary, have you got any top tips for landlords and tenant selection and things they should do? I've got 3 I'm going to share. I don't know if you've got a few bullet points you can share as well.
Okay, well, I feel I've talked a lot, so let's hear your 3. Go for it.
Yeah, I mean, my 3 are quite succinct. Don't rush or feel rushed by a tenant or an agent into choosing or selecting a particular tenant. Take your time because you can make mistakes that way. I would advocate buying rent guarantee insurance 100%, because if the insurer is willing to give you a guarantee on it, you know they must be good from a financial and employment sort of perspective. And I'd also say, don't instruct multiple agents. If you are using an agent and not doing it yourself, don't instruct multiple agents, because there is a little danger that agents enter into a bit of a race to try and get you that tenant and get you to sign on the dotted line. And sometimes some of the fluff, some of the gut and instinct can be overlooked because there's a pressure to get the deal done, get it over the line. So those are my 3 main top tips, Rachel. What about yours?
I'm very pleased that I let you speak first, because I would agree with all 3 of those tips. And it gives me a chance to add 3 of my own. So I would say be wary of anyone who says they can move in tomorrow, or who pressures you that they want to move in tomorrow. Yes, it may be legitimate, but no. Don't like it. I would say don't be completely hands off. So yeah, your agent tells you that referencing has been completed. Get them to talk it through with you. Who is this person that they're putting forward? What are the potential drawbacks? Do they have any concerns? What is the summary? What's their situation? And then the last one I would say is, if you are a let-only landlord, so you're going to be managing the property yourself, then I would say you absolutely need to meet that tenant before you sign any contract and they move into your property. Because what does your gut say about that person?
Sure. Okay, great. That's really helpful. I think without further ado, I think we need to say goodbye, Rachel, because we've talked at length about tenant selection this week. So
we have.
Thank you very much. And see you next time.
See you next week. Yeah. Bye-bye. If you enjoyed this episode, then we'd love your support. Please subscribe, leave a review, and share this episode of the podcast with your friends.
We'd also love to hear from you about any topics you'd particularly like us to discuss. Please send an email to yourlettingsjourney@gmail.com.
Thanks for listening, and see you for the next episode of Your Lettings Journey. Goodbye.
Goodbye.